My father is sick. I must return to him with food.
Go! Ride hard. Don't look back.
She rode into the storm with nothing but a promise. The cowboy whispered, "I'll hold them. Now ride hard." Ayanna Swiftwater tightened the rawhide strap of the worn satchel at her feet, the scent of sage and smoke clinging to the buckskin folds. Inside were only a few belongings: a carved bone comb, a pouch of red earth, her mother's beadwork, keepsakes of a life already half gone, carried into an uncertain tomorrow. The canvas walls of the lodge glowed with pale dawn light, the rising sun slipping through seams and casting long shadows across the packed dirt floor. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass like a whisper of warning. "You don't have to ride today," her uncle said from the entrance, his voice rough with age, his broad shoulders heavy with worry. "The buffalo will return in their season. Another hunter can go. You should stay with your father, Lun." Ayanna's hand lingered over the satchel strap. She was only 19, but grief and hunger had aged her into something older, harder. Her father, once the chief who had carried their people through winter storms, lay fevered on his bed of furs. His breath was shallow, his spirit walking dangerously close to the path of the ancestors. "If I do not go, he will die," she said quietly, her words steadier than her heart. "The herd is far, and we need its strength. I gave him my word." "Thou." Her uncle stepped inside, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "It is a cruel thing to ride alone into a land filled with rifles and rustlers. The white men hunt not for food, but for greed. If they find you, if you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming." Ayanna straightened, her mismatched eyes, one dark as fertile earth, the other pale as morning sky, fixed on him with a resolve that silenced further protest. "I am my father's daughter. His courage runs in me. If death waits, then so be it. But I will not wait here while he slips away." The lodge fell silent save for the shallow rasp of her father's breath. Ayanna bent to pick up the satchel, the leather cool against her palm, the weight of duty heavier than any load she had ever carried. She had nothing to cling to but her promise words spoken at a dying man's side. Outside, her pinto mare pawed the earth impatiently, breath clouding in the cold morning air. Beyond her stretched the endless sweep of the Great Plains, a wilderness as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Ayanna swung the satchel across her shoulder and stepped into the light, leaving behind the warmth of the lodge and the safety of childhood. The wind caught her hair and carried it westward. Somewhere out there, across valleys and hills, waited danger, destiny, and a stranger whose path would soon cross her own. Talon Morgan, the cowboy who did not yet know that his life, too, was about to change forever. Ayanna's hair streamed behind her like a dark pennant of defiance, the wind combing it with cold, ruthless fingers as she gripped the worn leather reins until her knuckles bleached bone white. The Great Plains sang with hooves. The sound rolled over the grass seas like thunder skimming a low sky. Beneath her, the pinto mare's breath sawed in ragged pulls, a bellows working past its last measure. Ayanna leaned low, whispering to the animal in a voice as hoarse as winter reeds, "Mitawa wichasha, my friend, one more mile, one more breath." The wind took the plea and tore it to threads. For 3 long days, and their knife-cold nights, she had chased a vanishing buffalo herd, not for glory, not for the old songs, but for survival. Her father, their band's aging chief, had sunk into fever like a man falling through lake ice. The winter was thin-bellied and mean. The people were tired. The stew was weaker than a snow-water tea. Buffalo marrow, buffalo liver, buffalo thick with life, that was the medicine he needed. What began as a hunt for hope had soured into a flight for her life, and now she felt the invisible line where the hunter becomes the hunted slice across her back like a lash. Behind her came the hyena cries of men whose hunger had nothing to do with meat. Their laughter carried on the wind, a hard, barking ugliness that didn't belong to the open country. Over all the rest rode a single sound, a cold, sleeting laugh that rattled like a snake's rattle in tall grass. Silas, the serpent miller. Men spoke his name with a curl of the lip and a touch at their gun belts, as if both a curse and a ward. He was a man with eyes the color of a mountain stream in deep January. Look too long, and your blood remembered snow. He and his crew of cattle thieves, claim jumpers and gold-bitten drifters had gnawed at the edges of Lakota country for months, stripping the earth with a miner's shovel and a scavenger's soul. They had heard whispers. White men always heard whispers of a sacred valley tucked between low, blue hills, where veins of metal crossed the bones of the world. They believed Ayanna knew how to find it. She did not. She sought meat, not metal, a full pot and a quiet fire, not a hole in the ground that made men forget their names. But truth was a tool Miller only pulled out when it could bludgeon. Greed was his first language, and every other word was a lie. She had tried to lose them in the land itself, slicing her trail through coulees where the shadows pooled, stepping her mare through creek beds to wash the spoor, threading the horse through cottonwoods, where evening light made all trunks look the same. But Miller's horses were fresh, and men like his never tired of the hunt. They nipped and harried and angled, and the plains, for all their size, felt smaller than a coffin. A rifle cracked the air. The sound was like the sky breaking. Ayanna flinched, a hot kiss of wind at her ear, as the bullet shaved a strand of hair and made it leap like grass in a storm. Her mare veered, stumbled, caught herself. Ayanna's jaw locked to iron. She would not give these men her fear, not in her face, not in her spine. "Run," she breathed, tasting grit. "Run like the wind that never stops." The mare answered, shoulders bunching, legs churning, but each stride was a promise the body could no longer keep. Ayanna dared a glance back. The black stallion that bore Silas Miller seemed to eat the ground in scoops. The man atop it grinned with a predator's joy, all teeth and winter light. He cupped a gloved hand to his mouth and let his voice whip forward. "Little Injun," he called, each syllable a bruise. "Where's the gold? Where's the pretty hole in the hills? Show me, or I'll skin the map right out of your hide." She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted the copper of herself. Her father's voice rose from memory, not the thin thread it had become in sickness, but the old voice, strong and laughing, the wind's brother. "Be brave, my daughter. Courage rides first, fear rides behind." The ache in her chest went from hollow to hot. "Wakang tuanka," she whispered toward the space where sky meets earth. "Not yet. Not today. I am not ready to walk the spirit road." The land swelled ahead. The grass flowed over a low hill like a green-black wave, and on its crest, a lone rider, inked against the pale. For a cut heartbeat, she thought the shape belonged to a bad dream, a mirage made of dust and dread. As he came down the slope at an angle, the horse underneath him seemed less ridden than worn, like a coat. Man and beast moved with the same intention, all straight lines and quiet power. A white man, yes, but something in the set of his shoulders, the absence of slop in his seat, the way he spared not one glance for Ayanna, only the threat behind her, something there said, not predator, not yet. He drew level without ceremony, hat brim casting a shadow that carved his face into planes and edges. The wind tried to take his voice and failed. "Stay close," he said, like a fact. "No hurry, no heat, just iron." Ayanna obeyed before she knew she had decided. "The way you step from a cliff, because a hand you trust says the river is deep enough." The man brought his rifle up with a motion that looked almost lazy, and the crack that followed bit the ground a breath ahead of Miller's lead rider. The animal went nearly vertical, screamed, and pitched its man into the prairie as if throwing up bad meat. The pack staggered, momentum broken, curses flaring like sparks. "That's your warning, Miller," the stranger called over his shoulder. The sound of it had the weight of an oath and the scrape of old trouble. "The next one hits flesh." Rage bloomed red at Miller's lips. "You'll pay for that, cowboy. She's got my claim." The stranger's laugh was a short, bright knife. "Your claim is what you work and keep, not what you scare out of a girl with a gang and a gun. You don't own the land, and you don't own her." Ayanna's breath snagged. The words tilted the world. The sky seemed a shade bluer for one blink. A defender, and no reason she could see but the shape of his bones. He flicked her a glance then, quick as a hawk's head. His eyes were blue, too, but not Miller's cold. They were the color of a lake the day after a storm, washed clean but not gentle. "Can that horse make Ironwood Creek?" he asked, voice lowering, still iron but with flesh on it now. "Maybe," she managed. Speaking scuffed her throat raw. "My father is sick. I must return to him with food." She tried to say more and did not have it. For a moment, a softening passed over his face like cloud shadow over grass. Then the wind carried forward the clink of harness and the hiss of men spreading left and right. The moment vanished. "Go," he said, and the single word landed like a hand on her back. "Ride hard. Don't look back. You—" The word was both protest and prayer. He reined slightly, putting his horse between her and the arc of danger like it had always been the plan. "Name's Talon Morgan," he said. "I'll hold him. Now go." She met his eyes, and some wordless exchange passed that neither of them would ever find language for. Then she touched her heels to the pinto, and the mare found, impossibly, a little more. The land opened, a gray-green fan spangled with prairie dog mounds and winter-yellow flowers, whose names her mother had once sung. The sky came down close, a lid of pewter. Far off, the Rockies wore snow like old kings wear fur. The mare's hooves drummed out the measure of a life fleeing its hunters. Ayanna counted breaths the way her father taught her to count coup. 1, 2, 3, live through this one, and you can live through the next. It was almost enough to make her think she would reach camp on a good wind and a prayer. Almost enough until a single gunshot broke the afternoon like a dish dropped on a packed clay floor. It came from ahead, from home. She did not remember the last stretch, only that the world narrowed to a tunnel and she was its arrow. When she slid from the saddle at the lip of their winter camp, the cold smacked her like a hand, as if to wake her before the dream cut too deep. The lodges were black shapes and tongues of fire. Her father's lodge wore flame like a monstrous flower, petals cracking with sap, wood popping like bones. Smoke scrawled its grief across the low sky. The body in the snow had already begun to give its warmth away. She knew him at once by the hair steel gray, braided with a strip of red-dyed quill that her mother's hands had made by the way one hand had curled near his chest, as if even death could not teach him to stop reaching for the people he loved. The hole in his shirt was small and round and obscene, neat as a hole in a drum, and everything that had once beat beneath it was quiet now. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Her scream flew out of her and made no dent in the day. She was on her knees without feeling the fall, gathering him to her, the smell of smoke and char and iron burning itself into a place behind her eyes where no water would ever wash it clean. 8, she said, the old word for father, the first word a child learns to attach to safety. "I came back. I came back." The lie was in exactly how late she was. Tears found her, then froze where the wind touched them. The cold made sympathy for once, but grief has a way of changing shape in a body that refuses to break. It shifted, lengthened, put on a new face. Ayanna lifted her head and the world swam. When it stilled, her two-colored eyes, her father said, one earth, one sky. A bridge between had the bright, frightening calm of a blade on a table. She could not go with him. She would not go with him. Not yet. The silence around the burning lodge was not pure. It had the edges of noise in it, the echo of hurried boots, the hiss of flame finding fat, the faint clatter of something dropped and left behind. Ayanna breathed in once, steadied, and began to look with the part of her mind that had followed tracks since she was small enough to ride in a travois. There were hoof marks at the edge of Camp 2, maybe 3 riders. One horse had a right hind shoe that left a chip like a notch. Snow was scuffed near the lodge, a long drag. Not her father's. He had fallen where he lay. Someone else had moved through here at speed. She found a brass cartridge half stuck in a patch where the snow had melted, then refrozen. She worked it free with numb fingers. The casing was bitten with a little scratch. Careless or a signature, she couldn't tell. A shallow S, like a snake mid-slither. She closed her fist around it, and the brass took the heat from her hand, as if it had a right to it. "Serpent," she said, and the wind carried the word off to warn the hills. The memory of Talon Morgan lashed back into her. The bright, efficient rifle. Work. The way he'd placed himself between her and danger. The way a tree steps in front of the wind. She saw the moment his name left his mouth. It had the feel of a man who had thrown away other names. Was he dead? Her mind wanted to go back down the trail, but the land pulled at her sleeve the way a child pulls when the house is on fire. There were things to do first. Ayanna laid her father down gently, as if the snow might bruise. She moved through the remnant of the lodge like a ghost seeking its own bones. Cloth. A strip of buffalo hide unburned on one side. A pouch of red earth, ochre for the old prayers. Sage, smoke, sweet, and crumbling. She took what she needed, and did not let herself look long enough at anything to turn it into a keepsake. On the slope above the camp she gathered stones. She did not count them. Counting was for later. This was for now. She built a ring against the wind and set a small fire with the cedar that had not yet caught. Smoke took to the air, blue, gray, and close to holy. She sang low, the song her mother had given her, a death song and a birth song that had the same bones, because that is how the world is made. You go where the river goes, she said to the place where her father's ear had once lived, and I will follow later with my hands empty and my back straight. No. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. She cut a small lock of her hair and tied it with the red quill strip pulled from his braid. She tucked it into the leather pouch along with a pinch of earth and ash. When she touched the old man's cold cheek, her hand did not shake. I bury you with the dignity the thieves tried to take, she said, voice steady because there was nothing left that could make it otherwise. I do not bury your name. I carry it. The work steadied her, as work does when tears have run out. By the time the sky lowered into evening, a hush had fallen even on the fire's mouth. The world's indifference felt less like cruelty and more like stubbornness. It would go on. So would she. When she rose, she was not taller, but the air around her seemed to make room for something it had not noticed before. She laid her palm on the pinto's neck. The mare had found a patch of brown winter grass and was worrying it with a kind of desperate politeness. We are not done, old girl, Ayanna said. We have a trail to find and a debt to call. She packed quickly. The pouch with hair and earth, a strip of dried meat gone tough as rawhide, a flint and steel, a water skin that would need filling soon. She dabbed ochre across her brow and cheeks. 3 strokes, earth, sky. The path between because the ritual wasn't magic but memory, and memory was a kind of armor. She tightened the cinch and checked the mare's shoes with a hand running more by habit than sight. Ayanna paused then, tipped her head like a coyote listening to a far-off answer, and let her mind turn back along the ways it had come. The cartridge in her pocket felt heavy as a promise, the hoof with the notched right hind, the line of men spreading to flank. Talon Morgan's voice saying, I'll hold him, as if it were not something a man could break his life on. The single report that had finished her father. Miller was cunning, but sometimes cunning men do stupid things because they think the world is a mirror and only they have a face. He had split his pack. He wanted the girl, and he wanted her map imagined or not so badly. He reached with both hands at once. He had sent men ahead while he chased. One shot, one hole. He wanted a message as clean as a bullet wound. She touched the place over her own heart where fear used to live and found, to her surprise, only heat. She walked the camp's edge, found the spot where 3 horses had stood impatient, while a 4th did the work impression stamped deep, the right hind of one marked with that little nick. She crouched, pressed her fingers into the snow the way her father had taught her to press into mud, feeling for the shape under shape. I will know you, she murmured to the sign. I will know you in the dark. No. When she finally swung back into the saddle, the moon, fat and low, was lifting itself over the far black seam of hills, and the grass made that dry, whispering sound that is nearly language. The stars came out with their old arrogance, blinking without pity. She wasn't asking them. The pinto started forward with the resigned heart of a brave thing that understands it will be asked to be brave again. Ayanna let the mare pick the first steps while she offered one more thread of thought to the man who had ridden into her life like a messenger out of a story. Talon Morgan. The name lay in her mouth with a weight that didn't belong only to the present. He might be dead now, thrown down under a welter of men and hooves, where the grass lay crushed the way grass tells you men have fought there. He might be alive, bleeding into his sleeve and saying a prayer through his teeth. Either way, he had thrown a line into a life that had been coming apart like a rope left in weather. She tucked the thought of him beside the pouch at her belt the way one tucks flint beside tinder. Not a fire yet, but the promise of one. The trail to Ironwood Creek lay northeast, braided through draws and low ridges, where cottonwoods planted their feet by the frozen water. She could swing wide to the east and cut back, or angle straight and risk being silhouetted on the rise when the moon climbed high. She chose the path the old Ayanna would not have chosen, the straight one. Grief had burned the waste from her. What remained did not fear being seen. The mare moved into a ground-eating trot that chose endurance over show. Coyotes sang somewhere to the south, their voices threading and unthreading like women's hands in a winter count robe. Ayanna felt the song shiver up her spine and down into her heels. "I hear you," she said to the night. "I know what it is to hunger." She took stock of the world the way a fighter takes stock of a room. The wind had shifted into her face. Good, it would take her scent away from the men she meant to follow. The cold wanted her fingers. She folded them against the reins, as if refusing a handshake. Her body hurt in that full, democratic way, where every muscle complains at the same volume. She accepted the complaints and gave them this answer. Later. Not a mile out she found what she had been half hoping for and half dreading. Churned, up ground where horses had fretted and a man had fallen and gotten up again. Blood sprinkling the snow like a stingy blessing. She slid down, crouched, touched 2 fingers to the red to test its age. New. Not minutes new, not hours old either. The prince led north and east. The right hind with the notch veered separately toward a line of low willows. The weight in her chest shifted. The serpent had split himself again, a head for every direction. Her father would have told her not to chase too many trails with one pair of feet. "Pick the one with teeth in it," he would say, smiling where the scar nicked his lip. She stood, eyes traveling the lines like a person reading a prayer by fingers in the dark. "Miller first," she said aloud, as if making it heard would make it easier. "Then the rest." She mounted, turned the mare with the gentle pressure of a leg and a thought, and set off at a pace that could devour the night without becoming it. Somewhere behind her, a ring of stones held her father's last fire to the world. Somewhere ahead, a man with a snake carved into his soul was riding a horse with a notched shoe and believing he had time, and threading between them like a bright wire was the memory of a cowboy who had placed his body between violence and a stranger because he'd decided it was the thing to do. The night peeled away in layers frost-silvered grass, the breath of the horse rising in little ghost puffs, the moon fattening as if it were feeding on her will. Ayanna did not hurry and did not slow, listening to the land the way a hunter listens to his own breath. She spoke once more to the shape that used to be home and now was a scar on the plain. 8, she said softly. "I carry you. I carry this." The scent of burning sage and a quiet prayer hung in the air as Ayanna carefully laid the last stone on her father's grave. The ashes of their lodge were cold, a bleak memory on the wind-swept plains. She had buried him in the traditional way, a sacred burial mound of rocks and earth, a monument to a life of honor and wisdom. Her work was done here. Now, only one task remained: justice. But first, she had to know what had become of the man who had risked his life for her. Talon Morgan. Her mind kept replaying the image of him, standing alone against Silas Miller's gang. The single, distant gunshot that had followed haunted her. She had to know for sure. Ayanna mounted her mare and set out, following the trail she had ridden just hours before. The tracks were easier to spot now in the light of dawn, and she noticed a second set of hoofprints alongside Miller's men, a trail that veered away from her own. Talon had indeed faced them alone. She saw the evidence of the brief, violent confrontation, scuffed earth, the mark of a fallen horse, and the spent casing of a rifle bullet. There was blood, too, a dark stain on the frozen ground. Ayana's heart sank. She dismounted, her hands trembling as she touched the cold earth. It was a lot of blood. He hadn't just been wounded. He had been hit hard. But there were no drag marks, no sign of a body. She followed the trail of horse tracks. A fresh trail now, heading toward the distant town of Ironwood Creek. He had survived. Against all odds, he had made it this far. Her focus shifted from vengeance to concern. He had saved her life. It was a debt of honor, a sacred trust. She had to help him. Ayana urged her mare onward, her thoughts a jumble of relief and worry. How badly was he hurt? Could he even reach the town? As she crested a small hill, she saw it. A lone rider, his body slumped over his horse's neck, a dark figure barely clinging to his saddle. It was Talon Morgan. She spurred her mare, riding to his side. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cold. His breath was ragged. "Talon," she said, her voice soft but urgent. He looked up, his eyes unfocused. "You came back," he murmured, his voice a strained whisper. "Thought you were gone for good." She reached out, her fingers pressing gently on his shoulder. He flinched. She saw the makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm, soaked with blood. "I had to," she said. "You saved my life." He gave a small, weary nod. "Wouldn't have been much of a favor if you died on the way home." Ayana took charge, her instincts honed by years of living on the plains. She dismounted and quickly assessed the situation. He was weak, and the wound was a bad one. He needed to be off his horse. "We need to get you to the town," she said. "The wound needs tending." He shook his head slowly. "Can't go into town, not like this. Miller's men will be looking for me." He paused, a wave of pain washing over him. "There's a homestead, a few miles from here. Wild Horse Mesa. That's where I live." Ayana looked at him, her bicolor eyes filled with a new kind of terror. Going into a white man's house. A house of a cowboy. It was unheard of for her people, but she had no choice. She couldn't leave him to die here in the cold. She helped him dismount, his weight a heavy, dead thing against her. He leaned on her, his arm a useless, painful appendage. Ayana, strong from years of hard living, supported him, half carrying him as she led both horses. They moved slowly, painfully, the simple act of walking a torturous ordeal for Talon. He gritted his teeth, not a single sound of complaint leaving his lips. He was a man of steel and unyielding will. She admired that. It was the same quality she saw in her father. After what seemed like an eternity, they saw it. A small, solitary cabin nestled on a mesa overlooking a vast canyon. It was well built, with a corral and a small barn. A plume of smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life, of hope. But the hope was short-lived. A man, an older cowboy, with a weathered face and a scowl that seemed a permanent fixture, was standing on the porch. He watched them approach, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Who's this, Talon?" he grunted, his voice a low growl. "And what in the hell did you get yourself into?" "Easy, Silas," Talon said, his voice strained. "This is Ayana. She helped me. I'm hurt. Silas, this is my foreman, Jebediah." Silas's eyes narrowed as he looked at Ayana. His gaze was full of suspicion and hatred, a look she had seen countless times. He didn't trust her. Ayana felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the raw hostility radiating from him. "An Indian?" Silas sneered. "What's an Indian doing with you, Morgan? We got trouble enough with her kind." "She is not her kind," Talon said, his voice rising with anger. "She is a good person, and she saved my life." He leaned heavily against the cabin door. "Now are you going to help me, or are you going to stand there and let me bleed out?" Silas hesitated, his gaze flicking between Talon and Ayana. He finally moved, his actions slow and deliberate. He helped Ayana guide Talon inside, his movements grudging, his hostility a palpable thing in the small, warm cabin. He laid him down on a small bed, his movements surprisingly gentle. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Vit voi van fong quatrin mo. Ayana knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wound. I have medicine, she said softly. Herbs. They will help. Silas scoffed. We've got Doc Miller in town. No need for your voodoo. Doc Miller couldn't help him, Ayana said, her voice steady. He needs more than just a bandage. He needs to heal from the inside. Talon looked at her, his eyes filled with a tired trust. Let her help, he said to Silas. I trust her. Silas, after a moment of consideration, nodded grudgingly. Just don't do anything stupid. Ayana ignored his mistrust. She was a healer. She was a daughter of the earth. She knew what to do. She gathered the herbs from her pouch, dried plants and roots she had carried with her for her father. She crushed them with a small stone, her motions deliberate and sure. She boiled water and steeped the herbs, the aroma filling the small cabin, a fragrant, medicinal smell that seemed out of place in this rough, male world. She cleaned his wound, and then, with a quiet strength, she carefully applied the poultice, the warmth of the herbs a soothing balm against the angry, inflamed flesh. As she worked, she could feel the tension in the room. Silas stood in the corner, his arms crossed, watching her every move, ready to pounce on any perceived threat. Ayana ignored him, her focus entirely on her patient. When she was finished, she turned to him. He needs to rest, she said, her voice low. He needs to be warm. I've done all I can for now. Silas nodded, his hostility a simmering, unspoken thing. He finally looked at Talon, a flicker of something close to concern in his eyes. You owe her your life, Morgan, he said gruffly. Talon looked at Ayana, a small smile on his lips. I know, and I will not forget it. For the next few days, Ayana stayed at Wild Horse Mesa, nursing Talon back to health. She boiled water for his compresses. She changed his bandages. She fed him the bitter herbal teas that would cleanse his body of the infection. Silas, though still mistrustful, seemed to accept her presence, if only because he saw the progress Talon was making. The fever that had gripped him receded. The wound began to heal, and Ayana, with her quiet strength and her knowledge of the land, became an indispensable part of his recovery. But the peace was a fragile thing. The news of the incident on the plains had spread to Ironwood Creek. Whispers of a conflict between a lone cowboy and a gang of rustlers mixed with rumors of a Lakota girl seen in the company of a white man. The men of the town, fearful and prejudiced, saw Ayana as a threat, a sign of trouble to come. She felt their eyes on her when she went to the town's general store, their whispers following her like a cold wind. The tension in the cabin was just as thick. Silas, fueled by the rumors from the town, had become more vocal in his objections. What's in it for you, little squaw? He'd grumble. You save his life. You live with him. What's the end game? Ayana would simply look at him with her steady, unchanging gaze. My father taught me honor, she said one day. When someone saves your life, you repay the debt. That is all. Silas scoffed, but she knew her words had struck a chord. Talon, however, was a different story. As he grew stronger, he began to ask her about her life, about her people, about her father. Ayana, though initially hesitant, found herself opening up to him. She told him about her father's wisdom, about their sacred traditions, about her dreams of a free life. She told him about her bicolor eyes, the sign of a dual spirit, a connection to both the physical world and the spiritual one. Talon listened, his eyes a deep, unwavering blue, his gaze full of a profound understanding. One evening, as she was preparing his dinner, he spoke of his own past. My name isn't just Talon Morgan, he said. It's Talon Hawk Morgan. I was a scout for the Union Army. We were sent to the Great Plains to map the land, to negotiate with the tribes. Your father, he was a leader even then. He trusted us. He gave us safe passage through his land. He taught me about honor. He gave me a peace I never knew before. Ayana's heart fluttered. Her father and this man, a white man, had been friends. He told me he had a daughter, Talon continued, his voice soft. He said she was fierce and strong, with eyes that held the sky and the earth. He was so proud of you, Ayanna. Tears pricked at Ayanna's eyes. The pain of her loss, the bitterness of her new reality, it all came rushing back. But there was also a glimmer of light, a sense of connection, a thread that connected her past to her present. Her father's last act had been to protect her, and now, here was his friend, a man he trusted, doing the same. The bond between them deepened, not just one of gratitude and duty, but one of mutual respect and understanding. Talon was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had risked his life for her. He listened to her. He didn't judge her. And Ayanna, for the first time since her father's death, began to feel something other than sorrow and a thirst for revenge. She felt a connection, a kinship, a spark of something new and fragile in the vast, empty space of her heart. But the world outside their cabin was not as peaceful. Silas, fueled by the rumors from the town, had become more vocal in his objections. "This is not right, Morgan," he said one afternoon, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You're getting too close to her, and I don't trust an Indian. She's got a motive. The town thinks she's a spy for her people. They're talking of sending a posse out here to get her." Talon, now strong enough to stand on his own, faced him, his eyes hard and unwavering. "Then they can come," he said. "I'll be ready." Ayanna listened, her heart sinking. She was a liability. She had brought trouble to Talon's doorstep. The debt she was trying to repay was now putting him in danger. She saw the conflict in his eyes. He was torn between his loyalty to Silas and his promise to her. She knew what she had to do. She had to leave. She had to go back to her people. She couldn't endanger him. She had a promise to keep, to get justice for her father. Later that night, as Talon slept, Ayanna crept out of the cabin. She had packed her small pouch with her remaining herbs and a few provisions. She would leave before dawn. She would not risk his life for her. She had come to know him, to respect him, to care for him, and she couldn't bear the thought of him being hurt because of her. She led her mare from the corral, her heart a heavy, aching thing in her chest. She had to go. She had to leave this place that had offered her a brief moment of hope, of connection. But as she reached the edge of the mesa, she heard a voice, a low, quiet sound that stopped her in her tracks. "Where do you think you're going?" It was Talon. He was standing there, his rifle in his hands, his face grim. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice a whisper. "I'm a trouble to you. To the town, I can't stay." He walked toward her, his limp still noticeable, but his presence a powerful, commanding thing. "I told you I'd protect you," he said. "I gave my word to your father. I will not break it. I will not let you walk out there alone." Ayanna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "I can't ask this of you." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out to her face. He wiped a tear with his thumb, his touch a gentle, steady presence against her cold skin. "I'm not doing it for you," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "I'm doing it for me. I'm doing it because it is the right thing to do, and I'm doing it for your father's memory. He would have wanted you to be safe." Ayanna looked into his eyes, and she saw it then. It was not a debt he was repaying. It was a promise he was keeping. He was a man of his word, a man of honor, and in that moment she knew that she had found something more than just a place to hide. She had found a partner, a companion, a soul as scarred and as brave as her own. They stood there in the cold moonlight, two lonely figures on a vast, unforgiving landscape. And in that quiet, desperate moment, they found a connection that was stronger than any spoken words. It was a bond of shared trauma, of mutual respect, and of a quiet, burning hope for a better future, a future where they could find justice and peace together. The fragile peace at Wild Horse Mesa shattered like thin ice under a rider's hoof. The sound was a single gunshot, lonely, echoing across the canyon walls until it was impossible to tell from which direction it had first torn free. In this country, a single shot meant many things: hunger, warning, death, but never peace. Talon Morgan heard it before Ayanna did. Though his shoulder wound had mostly healed, A faint ache still reminded him with every breath of the fight that had nearly ended him weeks ago. He moved like a man who had no intention of being slowed by pain, reaching for his rifle where it hung against the cabin wall. His fingers curled around the wood as if it were an extension of his body. Ayanna had been outside, cutting strips of dried venison, when the echo came. She froze, her knife halfway through the lean meat. A chill, sharper than the wind, swept through her. Her instinct spoke louder than words. Danger. She left the meat and hurried inside. Her mismatched eyes, one brown like the soil, one blue like the open sky, met Talon's. "They're here," she whispered. "The townspeople." Old Jebediah, stooped but wiry, spat into the fire and pulled on his old coat. "Hell's broken loose then," he muttered. "Time we found out just how bad." The three rode hard, hooves biting into frosted earth, breath streaming from the horses like smoke from small furnaces. The trail wound through cottonwoods, past the narrow cut of the creek where thin ice clung to shadows, then opened onto the edge of the valley. There they saw them, a small group of Lakota huddled close, their breath ragged from fear and cold. One of them, hardly more than a boy, lay sprawled on the earth, a dark stain spreading across his tunic, blooming wider with each heartbeat. His eyes fluttered but did not close. Across from them stood men from Ironwood Creek, rifles in hand, their barrels still warm. At their head was Deputy Marshal Jedediah Stone, his broad shoulders tight beneath a dusted coat, his mouth twisted in something halfway between righteousness and panic. Talon spurred forward, his fury boiling over before his horse had even stopped. "What in God's name is going on, Jedediah?" he roared, voice like thunder rolling off the canyon. Jedediah flinched, but held his ground, chest puffed with borrowed authority. "They were rustlin' our cattle, Morgan. We caught 'em red-handed, had no choice but to shoot one." Ayanna's gaze cut to the ground-scattered firewood, a small fire smoldering, rabbits strung from a pole. No cattle, no sign of stolen beef, only survival. "They were not rustling," she said, her voice low, steady, cutting like a blade through the falsehood. "They were hunting for food." Her eyes locked with Jedediah's, one blue, one brown, and the weight of that gaze made him falter for half a heartbeat before his temper flared. "Don't you talk to me, squaw," he spat. His words were a slap meant for both her and Talon. "You think being Morgan's little pet gives you the right to speak? You're part of this treachery." Lurd. The insult burned the air. Talon dismounted in a single, controlled motion, his boots grinding the frost. Fury radiated from him like heat off a forge. "Don't you ever speak to her like that again," he said, low, dangerous, his hand firm on the rifle. "These men were hunting, Jedediah. Look around you. There are no cattle here." Jedediah scoffed, though the flicker of fear betrayed him. "They were on our land. We've a right to defend what's ours." Then, the moment thickened like storm clouds piling. The Lakota shifted uneasily. The townsmen fingered their triggers. Old Jebediah muttered a curse and gripped his shotgun, knowing how thin the line was before hellfire. Ayanna dropped to her knees beside the fallen young Lakota. She pressed her hands against his wound, feeling hot blood slip through her fingers. "He lives," she said, a tremor of hope in her voice, "but he needs a doctor now." Jedediah barked a laugh, harsh and ugly. "Ain't no way we're taking a savage to our doctor." Talon's body was a shield before she had finished rising, his tall frame a wall of defiance between her and their hatred. "I'll take him," Talon said. His eyes swept the crowd, daring them, "and if anyone here's got a problem, they can settle it with me." The Ironwood men shifted, their confidence crumbling under the memory of Morgan's reputation, the man who had faced Silas Miller and lived. They muttered, but none stepped forward. With Ayanna's help, the boy was lifted onto her horse. They began the hard ride to Ironwood Creek. The town doctor, old Doc Miller, not kin to Silas, though the name was curse enough, grumbled when he saw what patient Talon dragged through his door. "Lord Almighty, Morgan, you know what folks'll say?" "Say what they want," Talon snapped. "You patch him up." The doctor obeyed, muttering about wasted supplies. After long minutes, he straightened. "He's lucky." Bullet missed his heart by less than an inch. Ayanna bowed her head, gratitude spilling into her, whispered thanks. Yet unease gnawed at her. The townsmen had been too quick to fire, too eager to see enemies in hungry men. The wounded youth stirred, his name spilling from cracked lips Koa. His eyes found Ayana's, and in them burned not gratitude but fury. "You are not one of us," he rasped. "You live with a white man. You betray your people." The words sliced deeper than Jedediah's insults. Ayana recoiled as if struck. Talon's hand settled on her shoulder, steady. "He is afraid," he murmured. "Fear speaks with poison." But poison or not, the sting lingered. Ayana felt her place slipping away from her people, who saw her as traitor, and from the town, who saw her as a danger. She was caught in the chasm between two worlds, belonging nowhere. By evening, worse news reached them. Silas Miller was back. Like a vulture, he circled trouble, feeding on fear. He whispered to Ironwood Creek that Talon Morgan had gone soft, that he was siding with Indians, betraying his race. The town, already brittle with prejudice, was ready tinder for his lies. The next day, the storm broke. A crowd of armed men marched to Talon's ranch, Jedediah at the front, Silas grinning at his side. And among them, to Ayana's shock, stood Koa, his wound bound, his pride unhealed. Koa pointed a damning finger. "They are not to be trusted. The woman is a witch. She bends white men with spells." Murmurs flared like brushfire. Jedediah shoved his rifle forward. "We're here for her, Morgan. She's a danger to this town." Talon stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled, his face carved in stone. "What do you want, Jedediah?" "We want the squaw." Ayana's chest tightened, her heart a storm trapped in a cage of bone. She looked at Talon. He met her gaze, calm even in the whirlwind. "Do you go with them?" he asked quietly. "Or do you stand with me?" The choice fell heavy, heavier than the sky. If she went with Koa, perhaps she could mend the broken trust, save herself from the mob's wrath. But she would betray the man who had stood between her and every bullet of hate. If she stayed with Talon, she risked everything, her life, her future, but claimed her truth. She saw him then, not just as a man but as the anchor that kept her from drowning in exile. His eyes were steady, his jaw firm, his whole being radiating the honor her people once said was the soul of warriors. He was her home. Ayana stepped forward, her mismatched eyes cutting through the mob. "I stand with Talon Morgan," she said, voice clear as canyon air. "He has done nothing but protect what is right. My people seek peace, not war." Confusion rippled the crowd. But Silas Miller's voice slithered through their doubt. "She lies. They all lie. They want our land, our cattle, our blood. And him," he jabbed a finger at Talon, "he's their accomplice, a traitor who sold his soul for a squaw's bed." The insult was fire poured over wounds. Ayana flinched, not for herself but for Talon. Talon's face hardened, rage honed to the edge of a blade. He stepped down from the porch, rifle rising. "That's enough, Miller. Leave now or face me. But hear this, I will not stand by while you defile her name or mine." The standoff froze the world. Horses pawed nervously. Men shifted their grips. The air itself seemed to wait. Ayana stood beside him, no longer victim, no longer torn, a partner, a warrior. She drew strength not only from love, but from the ashes of loss and exile. Her gaze found Koa. His eyes wavered, torn by doubt. He was a proud warrior, but pride had twisted under Silas's poison. She willed him to see truth. For one heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, as the sun slipped behind the canyon rim, the stage was set. Talon and Ayana against a world of hatred and lies. Their love was both weapon and shield. Their honor the last line between peace and bloodshed. The standoff shattered not by bullets, but by hooves. The pounding came first as a distant thrum, then as a growing roar across the hardpan earth. Dust curled into the air, and out of it burst a rider, small, frantic lungs, heaving as though he had outrun death itself. His pony lathered white, eyes rolling, hooves striking sparks on stone. The boy could not have been more than 12, his shirt torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He yanked the reins so hard the horse skidded sideways, almost toppling. "Jedediah," he gasped, voice cracking under the weight of what he carried. "Jedediah Stone." Every rifle lowered a fraction. Every breath seemed to wait. The boy swayed in the saddle, words tumbling out like rocks down a ravine. The mining camp, Old Hollow Ridge, it's a massacre. Everyone's dead. The clearing fell into stunned silence. The mob's fury, once a roaring fire, flickered as though wind had snuffed its oxygen. Even Jedediah's bluster cracked, his face drained pale. He stumbled forward, fists clenching around his rifle. Who? His voice came out a strained rasp. Who did it? The boy swallowed, eyes wide with terror. Don't know for sure, but there were Lakota arrows. And a note. His voice broke into a whisper, as if repeating it gave the words more power than he wanted. It said, "Justice is coming. The land will be returned." The effect was immediate. A wave surged through the crowd, fear breaking into rage, rage boiling into hatred. Men who moments before had hesitated now felt their blood ignite, faces twisted, hands tightened on rifles. The mob turned, as one body, toward the thought of Lakota camps hidden in the hills. Jedediah, seizing the moment like a drunk seizes a bottle, raised his rifle. "See," he bellowed, finding again the strength that fear had stolen. "See what they are? Raiders, killers, they butchered our people. We ride now." But not everyone's face was fury. Among them, Koa stiffened, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling like a man trapped between two storms. The arrows, the note, it was too neat, too perfectly carved into hatred. His people had their flaws, yes, but they did not massacre miners in cold blood, then leave childish notes like a brand. He had seen Silas Miller's sly grin earlier, heard his whispers, and now something clicked in his heart. This was wrong. This was a trick. Ayanna's hand shot to Talon's sleeve. Her mismatched eyes burned with sudden, terrible clarity. "Silas," she hissed, her voice low but carrying urgency. "This is his hand. He's setting us like dogs upon one another." Talon's jaw tightened. He had seen rustlers play this game before. Plant evidence, twist fear into vengeance, watch two sides tear each other to pieces while the real thieves fattened on gold and cattle. He nodded grimly. Classic snake work. Blame the Indians. Keep the posse blind while he takes what he wants. But the mob wasn't listening. Reason had no weight against bloodlust. Talon stepped forward, placing himself between Jedediah and the Lakota boy still groaning faintly on the horse. His voice cut steady, firm, like an anvil refusing to bend. "Jedediah, think. You didn't see this massacre. You've only got a story and some arrows anyone could plant." But Jedediah's eyes were fire. "I don't need to think. I need to protect this town." The crowd roared their agreement. The coiled snake of tension had become a stampede, ready to crash. Talon's gaze cut to Koa. Their eyes locked White Scout and Lakota warrior. Enemies by blood, rivals by pride. "Koa," Talon said, voice calm in the storm. "Do you believe this? Do you believe your people did this?" Koa's throat worked. His whole life told him to distrust men like Morgan. His anger earlier had fed that fire. But now, staring into Talon's unwavering eyes, he saw no deceit, no hunger for land or lies, only truth, raw and brutal. His chest swelled. "No," Koa said, voice low, gravel rasping through it. This is not our way. We fight to defend, not to butcher. This is a trap." "Then?" Relief flickered in Ayanna's chest like a fragile flame. "Then you must stand with me," Talon urged. "If we don't prove this lie, your people and this town will be drowned in blood before the week is out. We need to expose Miller for what he is." For a long heartbeat, Koa hesitated. He looked at the Lakota boy, at Ayanna's steady eyes, at the mob twisting with fear. Then his spine straightened. His voice rose, sharp, commanding, the voice of a man born to lead. "This is a lie," he thundered, turning on the crowd. "My people do not write foolish notes. We do not kill miners for vengeance. Do not be tricked. This is a snake's work." The crowd wavered, confusion slipping into their rage. But Silas Miller felt the ground sliding beneath him. His carefully spun tale was unraveling. He would not let it die. With a snarl, he ripped his pistol free, raising it toward Koa. "He lies," Silas shrieked, voice breaking into madness. "He's one of them. They're all traitors. Kill them all. Time fractured. Talon's rifle lifted in a smooth arc, faster than a man with a limp had any right to move. His shot cracked the air. The bullet smashed into the dirt just before Silas's boots, sending up a spray of dust and rock. "Drop it, Miller," Talon growled, voice quiet but deadly. The kind of voice that did not bluff. The mob froze. Eyes darted between Miller's wild glare and Morgan's iron steadiness. And in that frozen instant, truth uncoiled like a rattler revealed. Silas Miller was no savior. He was the serpent who had whispered poison into their ears, the thief who would pit neighbor against neighbor until only he feasted. The townsfolk saw it. Shame rose like bile. Rifles lowered. Faces turned hard, not at Lakota, not at Talon, but at the man they had followed too long. Silas stammered, backing a step. But words failed him. Talon strode forward, eyes burning. "I've got proof." He pulled from his saddlebag a folded scrap of parchment. He held it high so all could see. A map. Found it on Miller's trail. It marks a new gold strike right on Lakota land. He was going to steal it while you bled each other dry. Gasps rippled through the mob. The boy who had ridden in with the message began to sob quietly, realizing he had been used as Miller's pawn. Talon's voice rang clear. He killed, he lied, he tried to start a war, and he nearly succeeded. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then Jedediah, face twisted not with rage now but with shame, lowered his rifle. "God help us," he whispered. "We've been played for fools." The crowd broke. The fever left them, leaving only horror and exhaustion. Silas Miller was seized, his pistol ripped away, his shouts drowned beneath the heavy silence of betrayal. Shackles bit his wrists before the weight of his sins even settled. The aftermath was quiet, heavy as snowfall. Talon stood with Ayanna at his side, Koa before him. The Lakota warrior's pride was stripped, but what remained was honor, gleaming like steel. Slowly, Koa extended his hand. His voice carried, strong but humbled. "You are a man of truth. You saved my people from slaughter. I owe you more than words." Talon clasped his hand, firm, steady. For the first time in years, he smiled, not the bitter curve of a man surviving, but the true, unguarded smile of one who had found his place. "The land is wide enough for all of us," he said, "if we've the courage to share it." Ayanna's chest ached with pride. She looked at him, not just the man who had shielded her from hatred, but the man who had shielded two peoples from war. He had proven that honor was not bound by color, nor by tribe. The townsfolk lowered their eyes when they looked at her now. Not with hate, but with something new: understanding, reluctant respect, perhaps even shame. The serpent was caged, the lie revealed, and in that fragile, flickering moment, a peace fragile as glass, but real, settled across Ironwood Creek and the Lakota hills. Ayanna slipped her hand into Talon's, mismatched eyes burning with new fire. They had faced hatred and betrayal and had stood unbroken, not because they belonged to one world or the other, but because together they had forged something stronger than fear. Love, honor, a home in the wild land that had tried to break them. The dust over Ironwood Creek lingered for days, a fine ochre powder that coated windows and settled on the leaves of cottonwood trees, as if the land itself could not decide whether peace had truly come. The gun smoke had thinned to a memory, its acrid smell replaced by the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. The cries of the mob had long faded, absorbed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the prairie. And yet, in the eerie silence that remained, one could still feel the echo of what might have been: war, blood, and a final, apocalyptic annihilation. Instead, there was something else, something fragile and trembling, like the flame of a candle left in the open wind. A new peace, born from the brink of disaster, was taking root. Silas Miller, the serpent who had woven lies as easily as other men wove rope, was gone. Shackled, spat upon, his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed defeat, he was thrown into the steel belly of a train that hissed eastward toward a federal prison. His gang followed, a broken, pathetic procession. Their reign of terror ended not by a hail of bullets, but by the simple, unassailable weight of justice. For years, they had stalked the territory like wolves without honor, living on greed, deception, and the fear they so expertly cultivated. But even wolves could be caught, and even serpents could be crushed underfoot. The townsfolk of Ironwood Creek watched that train disappear with more than just relief. They watched it with a profound and humbling sense of shame, for it was not only Miller who had fed on hatred, it was they themselves who had allowed his poison to thrive. Their deep-seated fear of the Lakota, their blind prejudice, and their desperate, grasping desire for more land and cattle had made them easy prey for Miller's venomous words. And now, humbled by the clarity of hindsight, they walked their streets with quieter, more reflective steps. They looked at Ayanna differently now. The woman they had once called squaw, spat at, and distrusted was revealed as braver than any of them. She had faced down guns with nothing but her voice and her unwavering honor. Her mismatched eyes, one brown like the rich, dark earth, the other blue like the endless prairie sky, became a silent symbol of truth, a powerful reminder that two worlds could exist within one body and not be broken by it. Koa, too, was changed. The young warrior who had once spat accusations at Ayanna now stood taller, no longer only a son of the plains but a man tempered by mistake and redeemed by courage. His words, once brash and filled with youthful anger, began to carry the weight of wisdom among both the Lakota and the townsfolk. He became a living bridge, a connection neither side had thought possible, proof that trust could bloom even in burned soil. And then there was Talon Morgan, the cowboy who had lived in silence, his past sins and his rifle his only companions, was no longer the lone ghost of the plains. He was a hero now, a man whose name carried weight not through fear or reputation but through deep-seated respect. He had defended justice. He had defended love. He had defended both peoples when no one else had dared. Yet even as men tipped their hats and women whispered his name with reverence, Talon felt the burden heavy. For to be a hero meant to be chained by expectations, and he had never been a man who wore chains well. A fire on the porch, the weight of expectations. One evening, the sun burned low across Wild Horse Mesa, casting long purple shadows and setting the air aglow with fire. The cabin porch creaked under Talon's boots. Ayanna sat beside him, a shawl wrapped close against the evening chill, her dark hair catching threads of firelight from the dying day. The distant mountains glowed purple, their peaks softened by the haze of sunset, and the air was rich with the scent of pine resin and the faint smoke of distant cookfires. But Talon's eyes were not on the beauty. They were distant, shadowed, gazing at a horizon that was no longer just a line where the sky met the earth, but a boundary he feared he could not cross. "What is it?" Ayanna asked gently, her voice a soft counterpoint to the creaking porch. He exhaled, long and slow, as if letting go of words he had carried too long, words that had settled in his heart like stones. "This peace, it feels too fragile, like a glass waiting for the wrong hand to shatter it." She turned toward him, her eyes searching, their mismatched colors a perfect reflection of the world they were trying to build. "I'm not built for this," he said, the words a raw confession. "I'm no hero. Just a man who did what had to be done. They call me savior now, protector. But I'm just me, a cowboy who's lived too long with ghosts. I don't know if I can be the man they think I am. I'm a cowboy love story kind of man, Ayanna. Not built for sermons and responsibility. I'm a Wild West love story out there on the plains, not tied down." Ayanna reached for his hand, her touch warm against the evening chill, her fingers weaving through his as if binding two worlds into one. "You don't need to be their hero," she said, her voice firm and clear. "You only need to be you, a man of honor. That is enough." But his eyes still held doubt, storm blue and restless. "And if it isn't, what if my kind of Wild West love isn't enough for this new life they expect me to live?" Her heart ached with recognition. She, too, had felt the powerful pull of the open range, the call of the wind across tall grass, the endless horizon where sky kissed earth. She had lost everything once, her family, her people's way of life. Yet here she was, building anew beside him. And she knew then, as she looked into his doubting eyes, that they were the same. Neither of them was meant to live within fences. "Then we don't stay," she said simply, her voice suddenly hard with certainty, a sound like a stone striking against rock. "We go. Back to the open range. We find a new place, a new home. Just us." "They'll?" His head turned sharply, surprise cutting across his rugged features, the shadow of a smile beginning to form at the corners of his mouth. "You'd leave? After all this? You'd give it up for me?" She smiled, a radiant, all-encompassing light like the dawn itself. "I would give up everything for you, Talon Morgan. My only life is the one we build together. Our cowboy love stories are just beginning." And so the decision was made. It was both a profound sacrifice and an exhilarating liberation. They would not become part of the town's fragile, demanding fabric. They would not attend its rigid dances, its Sunday services, or its gossiping circles. They would belong instead to the land, to themselves, to a freedom larger than any house or any street. They packed what little they had: rifles, ammunition, blankets, beans and flour, strips of dried venison. Ayanna carried sage, her mother's beadwork, a single feather from her father's headdress. Talon carried an old cavalry knife, worn not as a weapon, but as a silent reminder of a past he had now outrun. The call of the horizon, a new kind of freedom. Old Jebediah was the first to see them off. His eyes misted as he stood at the corral gate, leaning on his shotgun like a crutch. "Damn shame," he muttered, his voice gravelly with emotion. "Town could use you too, but I reckon the wide world needs you more." His old gnarled hand trembled as he shook Talon's, then held Ayanna's gently, as if she were the daughter he never had. Koa came next, proud yet solemn. The scar across his chest, a testament to the night's violence, was still a raw pink line, but his voice carried the weight of a man reborn. "Go," he said. "I will keep the peace here. You ride your own trail, but remember you have kin among us now." "No. Mita kuye oya seeing," Ayanna whispered in Lakota. "We are all related." The words were a promise, a thread of connection that would stretch across the endless miles. And at dawn, with the last stars still fading in a sky awash with gold, they rode out. The prairie embraced them like an old friend. The air was clean and sharp with the scent of sage. A herd of bison moved in the distance, black shapes rolling like thunder across the endless grass. The wind brushed their faces, a constant, whispering voice speaking of freedom. They camped that night by a clear, fast-moving stream, the fire crackling low and spitting sparks into the darkness. Ayanna told him stories of her childhood, of her father teaching her to track elk across the broken land, of her mother singing ancient songs under the stars. Talon, silent at first, began to share his own, nights on campaign, the searing shame of orders he had followed as a boy, scout for the cavalry, the ghosts of burned villages that haunted his sleep. His voice cracked once, a raw, painful sound, but Ayanna's hand on his shoulder steadied him, her touch a silent absolution. "You are no longer that boy," she said softly. "You are the man who saved us all." The firelight caught his smile, small and fragile but real. Days later, a storm found them. Lightning split the plains with a violent, blinding light, and the rain drummed down on the earth like 1,000 war songs. They huddled together beneath their oilskins, laughing even as the thunder shook the ground beneath them. "The land is testing us," Ayanna said, her voice filled with a fierce joy, "seeing if we are worthy." "We'll pass," Talon answered, his arms pulling her close. And so they rode on, through sun and storm, through the sharp pangs of hunger and the easy comfort of laughter, through nights where coyotes sang to the moon and mornings where the horizon seemed to stretch on forever, a beckoning promise. They did not know where they were headed. Perhaps Montana, where the buffalo still roamed in great, shaggy herds. Perhaps the deserts westward, where red cliffs burned under the sunset. Perhaps nowhere at all. Only forward, always forward. But they knew one thing with an unshakable certainty. They were together, free, healing, home, two souls, now one heart, riding toward a horizon that never ended. Years later, around fires in both Lakota camps and Ironwood Creek saloons, their names were spoken in hushed, reverent tones. The cowboy who defended a Lakota girl, the Lakota woman who defended his honor, a Wild West love story that had defied hatred and prejudice. A cowboy love story whispered into legend. Children played at being Talon and Ayanna, pretending to ride against rustlers, pretending to choose love over fear. Old men shook their heads with a weary, knowing wisdom and said, "That was the way it was, hard, beautiful, true." And out on the range, where the grass bowed beneath the endless wind, some swore they could still see two riders at dawn. Silhouettes against the rising sun. Free, forever. I was just a boy when it all happened. Too young to carry a rifle. Too old to believe the world was fair. Ironwood Creek was my whole universe, then a cluster of rough-hewn buildings clinging to the prairie, ringed by cottonwoods and the endless sweep of grass. We thought ourselves hard people, living in a hard land, but we were softer than we knew, easy prey for fear and the whispers of men like Silas Miller. I remember the day it broke, the day the mob nearly tore our town in two. I remember the Lakota girl with eyes that didn't match, one brown like the soil, the other blue like the high sky. She stood beside a cowboy we all feared and admired, Talon Morgan. They didn't flinch, not once, even when our rifles were aimed square at them. People ask me now, years later, how it felt. I'll tell you plain. It was like watching the wind refuse to bend, two souls standing steady while the rest of us twisted like grass before a storm. Silas was unmasked that day, his lies spilled out, his map exposed, his pistol slapped from his hand. They shackled him, put him on a train east. Folks whispered he rotted in a federal prison, but to me he died the moment his poison was revealed. And when the dust settled, we all had to look each other in the eye. That was harder than facing Silas, harder than rifles, because we saw our shame staring back. We had been willing to kill for a lie. Ayanna Swiftwater, I'll never forget her name. Some in town still called her Squaw under their breath, but not where I could hear it. Not after what she did. She wasn't just Lakota. She was courage, standing with nothing but her voice between us and bloodshed. And Talon Morgan was a ghost before all this. A loner with eyes that looked past you, like you were smoke. We told stories about him, how he once scouted for the Union Army, how he'd killed more men than he could count. Some said he wasn't even flesh and bone, just a shadow with a rifle. But after that day, he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was flesh and honor and choice, and the choice he made was her. I watched them in the weeks that followed. The town did too. They didn't hide it, didn't have to. He walked with her, she with him, and people stared with a mix of awe and shame. The cowboy who defended the Lakota girl, the girl who stood by his side. Together, they carried something bigger than themselves. But you could see it in Talon's shoulders, the weight. He wore respect like a yoke. Men tipped their hats. Women whispered his name like a hymn. But he looked east at dawn, west at sunset, always restless, as if the horizon itself was calling his name. And Ayanna, she carried her father's death like a scar under the skin. She smiled sometimes, soft and rare, but her eyes always searched the wind, as if she expected it to bring both danger and destiny. The night they left, I couldn't sleep. Something in the air was restless. I snuck out of our cabin and climbed onto the roof, and I saw them, just two shadows at the edge of town, saddling their horses under the stars. Old Jebediah stood with them, his shotgun a cane in his hands. He clasped Talon's shoulder like a father. Then he bent low, speaking to Ayanna in a voice too soft for me to catch. She touched her brow to his hand before she mounted. Koa came too. He was still young, but there was steel in his spine now. He raised his hand in farewell, and Ayanna whispered something in Lakota that carried on the wind like a prayer. Then they were gone, riding into the first blush of dawn. I swear to you, the sunrise looked different that day. Brighter, wilder, like the sky itself wanted to mark their leaving. Years rolled on. The town grew, then shrank again, the way prairie towns do. New faces came, old ones faded into the ground. But the story remained. I carried it with me into manhood, and I wasn't the only one. In saloons, men told it between drinks. Around campfires, drifters passed it along. In Lakota camps, children heard it as a story of hope. that one of their own had walked with a cowboy, and together they'd faced down hatred. Some swore they saw them again, up north, where the buffalo still roamed. Out west, by red canyons. Traders spoke of a tall man with storm-blue eyes and a Lakota woman with healing hands. Were they true? Who can say? Out here, truth and legend ride the same horse. But there was one thing that made me believe. It was years after they left. I was a grown man by then, working the freight wagons. One dawn, we were cutting across the open plains, the sun just a red smear on the horizon. And I saw them, two riders, side by side, their silhouettes sharp against the rising light. They didn't wave, they didn't slow, they just rode, steady, into the endless. My partner swore it was a trick of light, but I knew better. I knew what I saw. Now I'm old, and my hands shake when I write this, but my heart steadies when I remember them. Talon Morgan and Ayanna Swiftwater, the cowboy and the Lakota girl. They didn't stay to become part of our town's story. They became something larger. A Wild West love story. A cowboy love story. Proof that love could cut through fear sharper than any blade. So if you ever ride out on the plains at dawn, and you hear hoofbeats when the world is still too quiet for them, look to the horizon. You might just see two riders, side by side, free, forever. This was not a love story in the way most folks imagine it, but it was, in truth, a love story nonetheless, a cowboy love story of the deepest kind. A love for humanity, for honor, for the grace that transforms a wanderer into a brother. It was a Wild West love like no other, a testament that in the brutal heart of the frontier, a single act of kindness could ignite a Wild West love story that changed everything. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it,
Take my
a
hand.
blessing may
Hold tight.
quietly find its way into your life. She was running barefoot from her father's farm until a cowboy caught up and swept her off her feet. Texas, 1875. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance as Abigail Abby Maeve's bare feet pounded against the hard-packed earth, her breath ragged and desperate. At 19, she had finally found the courage to escape the desolate life forced upon her. But freedom came with a price she wasn't prepared to pay. Blood from her cut feet mingled with the dusty soil of the Texas prairie as she ran blindly through the tall grass, the hem of her tattered dress catching on sharp brambles. The unforgiving landscape of the Texas frontier offered little mercy to a young woman alone. Abby's dark hair streamed behind her like a banner as she glanced over her shoulder, seeing the silhouettes of the lawless men on horseback in the distance. They were gaining on her with every passing second. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed herself harder, knowing what awaited her if they caught her a fate worse than death. She was nothing to them, just a witness, a loose end to be tied up. There she is. One of them boomed across the open prairie. Get her. Abby choked back a sob as she crested a small hill, her vision blurring from exhaustion and tears. She had been running for nearly an hour, having slipped away during the pre-dawn hours while the household slept. But they had discovered her absence sooner than she'd hoped, and her head start was rapidly diminishing. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, approaching from a different direction than her pursuers. Abby's panic intensified. Was this another of her father's friends, ready to drag her back to that hellish existence? She changed course, veering toward a stand of cottonwood trees, her only possible shelter. "Miss, this way," a deep voice called out. A tall cowboy on a magnificent chestnut stallion galloped toward her, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He extended his arm as he maneuvered his horse alongside her. "Take my hand," he urged, his blue eyes intense beneath the brim of his hat. Abby hesitated for only a second before the sound of her father's approaching horses made the decision for her. She reached up, and felt the cowboy's strong grip close around her wrist. With a swift, powerful movement, he lifted her off the ground and swung her up onto the saddle in front of him. "Hold tight," he commanded, wrapping one arm around her waist as he turned his horse and spurted into a gallop. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. It all started the day they came. The day a world I thought I knew was torn to shreds. A world of dust and sun-scorched earth where my grandmother's wisdom was my only guide. My grandmother, she was the last of her tribe, a well of stories and knowledge